Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 20 Years of Data EDI Wave 8 BC Summary webinar. It's a delight to have you all join us today to look at the latest EDI data. I'm Mariana Brussoni. I'm the director of the Human Early Learning Partnership and a professor at the University of British Columbia and the BC Children's Hospital Research Institute. And I help the Human Early Learning Partnership is a research center at the University of British Columbia, which is dedicated to improving the health and well-being of children through interdisciplinary research and knowledge mobilization. Thank you all for taking the time out of your days, very busy days, to join us to look through and learn from our latest data. I want to let you all know that closed captioning for this webinar is available. You can find it by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. You should see it there shortly, if not already. As we have a big audience with us today, we can't have everyone on the screen with us. We would like to ask the audience to introduce themselves in the chat. If you could just say your name and your organization. So I'd like to begin, first of all, by acknowledging that our work at HELP takes place at UBC Vancouver campus, which is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I would also welcome each of you, as you put your introduction in the chat, to acknowledge the territories that you're in. Now, the slide you see here, the picture, is the UBC reconciliation pole, which was carved and painted by Haida master carver Edenshaw James Hart and his assistants. It represents the history of Indigenous people in Canada before, during, and after the residential school era. We acknowledge and we mourn the death and abandonment of the many Indigenous children who were forced to attend residential schools across this province and this country. We have a long road ahead of us to truth and reconciliation. And at HELP, we're very fortunate to have the guidance from the Aboriginal Steering Committee, which was established in 2003. It's my pleasure and my privilege to introduce Dwayne Jackson. He's one of the elders on the Aboriginal Steering Committee and a longtime committee member who has graciously offered to provide a welcome for us to this event. Dwayne Jackson is from the Gittinmaks of the Gitxsan Nation. With a background in early childhood education, he has worked with Success by Six and Children First, as well as partnered with various early childhood and health initiatives in BC. He's been a youth basketball coach for the past 32 years and was the recipient in 2006 of the Aboriginal Coach of the Year by the Aboriginal Sports and Recreation Association of BC. Dwayne is also focused on men's health. He's the founder of Taukgach Men's Program, which focuses on being a whole person. The idea is not to look at what it means to be a man within today's society, but rather to get an understanding of what it means to be a whole person. Dwayne has been an Aboriginal Steering Committee member for 13 years. Welcome, Dwayne.
Thank you, Mariana. Amasa, good day. Loa yats, the way. It's in Wales, what's in Laha, what's up with me? My name is Loa Yats. Of course, my given name is Dwayne Jackson. I'm Giskas, which is fireweed, as Mariana said, of the Gittinmaks Nation of whole old Hazelton. I studied early childhood education and development when I was 40 years old. And people ask me how I got into that. And I tell them, well, I coached adult men's basketball. It's almost the same, but there's a lot less whining now and I do a lot less negotiating. So, it's the way it worked out. But it actually changed my life. So I'd like to welcome all of you here. Thank you so much for attending today and really taking part in the responsibility of not only the collection of stories, which is what data is, the collection of stories, but also the protection of stories and to hold those stories close and to honor the relationship that we have with bringing that information in. And we would normally open the circle with a prayer. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a poem with you that I found just right coming out of my early childhood education training, when I had discovered that advocacy was really the path that I wanted to take. And when I read this poem here was one of the reasons why I did it. So we can just get comfortable, and I'll share this with you: a creator, a great spirit, and the spirit of all those that came before. Okay. The invitation. It doesn't interest me what you do for a living. I want to know what you ache for, and if you dare to dream of meeting your heart's longing. It doesn't interest me how old you are. I want to know if you will risk looking like a fool for love, for your dream, for the adventure of being alive. It doesn't interest me what planets are squaring your moon. I want to know if you have touched the center of your own sorrow, if you have been opened by life's betrayals or have become shriveled and closed from fear of further pain. I want to know if you can sit with pain, mine or your own, without moving to hide it or fade it or fix it. I want to know if you can be with joy, mine or your own, if you can dance with wildness and let the ecstasy fill you to the tips of your fingers and toes without cautioning us to be careful, be realistic, remember the limitations of being human. It doesn't interest me if the story you are telling me is true. I want to know if you can disappoint another to be true to yourself, if you can bear the accusation of betrayal and not betray your own soul. If you can be faithless and therefore trustworthy. I want to know if you can see beauty even when it is not pretty every day, and if you can source your own life from its presence. I want to know if you can live with failure, yours and mine, and still stand at the edge of the lake and shout to the silver of the full moon, yes! It doesn't interest me to know where you live or how much money you have. I want to know if you can get up after the night of grief and despair, weary and bruised to the bone, and do what needs to be done to feed the children. It doesn't interest me who you know or how you came to be here. I want to know if you still stand in the center of the fire with me and not shrink back. It doesn't interest me where or what or with whom you have studied. I want to know what sustains you from the inside when all else falls away. I want to know if you can be alone with yourself and if you truly like the company you keep in the empty moments. Oriah Mountain Dreamer. I think we get caught up in a lot of these pieces, and I talk about my master's degree, and people kind of get offended by it, and they say, well, because I tell them, I say, well, the degree itself actually holds no value to me. What actually holds value to me is the tools and information that I've obtained now through my master's degree to be put into service for the people that I serve. That's truly why I get these pieces. And so I think, once again, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today here. I'm here with my HELP family, who of course, I've been with for 13 years, and I hold them very, very close to my heart. And I hope you really, really enjoyed the presentations today. I absolutely honor all of you.
Thank you so much, Dwayne. What an inspiring poem. And you've been so good about reminding us about our duty to serve and service of others. And I thank you so much for all the wisdom you've provided. There's been a request for the source of the poem, if you wouldn't mind adding it to, oh, Bonnie Barrett has added it. Thank you. Great. So with those inspiring words, let's dig into the data and let's think about what the data will tell us about how we need to serve the children of BC. So as an overview of what we'll be covering in the next hour and a half, I'll begin by introducing the Child Development Monitoring System and the Early Development Instrument, which is most of the data we'll be covering today. Then we'll dig into the Wave 8 data and the trends over the last 20 years of the EDI data collection. Following my bit of the presentation, 3 helpers, so staff and faculty, will provide some reflections and highlight some current research, and we hope to gather some of your reflections as we go. Finally, we'll conclude with, time permitting, a question period and some closing remarks. So just some quick housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the HELP YouTube channel when it is ready. We'll be releasing the EDI Wave 8 Provincial Summary online report to all of you at the end of this webinar. We'll share it via a link in the chat, but we will also be sending a follow-up email with the information included as well, so that you'll have time to dig into everything that we talk about today. At the bottom of your screen, you will notice both the Q&A button and the chat feature. If you have questions as you listen, please type the questions into the Q&A feature, not the chat. We will be responding to questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A section. We will not be monitoring the chat for questions, so please use the Q&A feature. Add your reflections to the chat. We will do our best to get as many questions as we can this morning, or this afternoon, I should say. So now, launching right in. At HELP, our work is grounded in the understanding that children live, grow, and learn within many interconnected contexts, which impact their experiences and development. At HELP, we call this impact being from society to cell. What you see here are 2 models that help provide a perspective on the various influences on children's lives. The one on the left is from HELP, and the one on the right is from First Nations Health Authority. What they illustrate is the various contexts. So from the global context, for example, the COVID pandemic or climate change, to national and provincial policies influencing health and social systems, the economy, minimum wage, housing, down to neighborhoods and community influences, including access to services, and closer into land and green spaces that children have access to, through to individual level or immediate influences such as family and culture. Decades of research has shown that early child development is itself a social determinant of health. What that means is that the quality of the experiences and the environments in which children grow and develop in the early years have long-reaching impact on the health and well-being over time and across generations. Children's experiences in the early years influence the way that children's genes are expressed, for example, in language or regulation of emotions. A child's ability to learn when they enter school is strongly influenced by brain development that takes place in these early years prior to school. Early child development is in turn a lifelong determinant of health, well-being, and learning skills. In 1999, Dr. Clyde Hertzman and Dr. Hillel Goldman pioneered a program of research to explore the differences that make a difference in children's early development. Dr. Hertzman understood that without high-quality data and research, problems would remain unseen and no action would be taken to solve them. Dr. Hertzman envisioned a unique child development monitoring system that follows populations of children across their development, offering high-quality data and research to inform actions to ensure equity from the start for all children. At HELP, we collect data about children's experiences and development through the Child Development Monitoring System, which consists of 5 questionnaires: the TDI, CHECK, EDI, MDI, and YDI, that provide connections across the early life course from toddlerhood into kindergarten in grades 4 and 8, and finally through secondary school in grade 11. The monitoring system gathers information on critical periods in children's development, exploring individual, family, and community factors from a diversity of perspectives, parents, teachers, as well as children themselves. These questionnaires support the collection of population level data about children's outcomes and experiences and environments that are needed to address and answer the question, what are the differences that make a difference? I'll note that the YDI is an affiliated population level tool developed and implemented by Dr. Hasina Samji, who is an affiliate health faculty and is with SFU and BC CDC. The foundation of the monitoring system is the Early Development Instrument, or EDI. We now have 20 years of data here in BC. The collection of the EDI is funded by the BC Ministries of Health, Education and Childcare, and Child and Family Development. The EDI is a questionnaire completed by kindergarten teachers for the students in their classrooms in February of the school year. The intention of the EDI is to reflect the development of the whole child. These are the 5 scales of the EDI: physical health and well-being, language and cognitive development, communication skills, and general knowledge, emotional maturity, and social competence. So completed EDI questionnaires are grouped together to give a snapshot of how children are doing at the school district, the neighborhood, and the provincial level. EDI measures the distribution of developmental outcomes in populations of kindergarten children. You can see a copy of the questionnaire on our website, along with more details about the EDI and all of the scales and subscales. The EDI is a population level monitoring tool. Data are used to consider the health and well-being of populations of children now and over time. The EDI is not meant as an individual assessment or diagnostic tool, nor is it used to evaluate teachers or schools. In Canada, EDI data have been collected in all but one of the provinces and territories, and at this time, there are EDI data for 1.3 million children across the country. The EDI is also collected in several international jurisdictions, supported by the Offord Centre for Child Studies out of McMaster University. I want to point out, HELP has a new website. Please go visit it. Our website and newsletter are a great way to stay up to date with HELP events, data releases, and research newses. And so immediately after this presentation, you will be able to see the EDI Wave 8 Provincial Summary online report on our new website. Early in the new year, we'll be releasing the community and neighborhood level EDI data through an online interactive data dashboard that will also be available through our website. So lots more exciting stuff to come. This graphic shows the data collection history for the EDI in British Columbia. The EDI questionnaire is province-wide. 57 school districts participate, along with some participating independent First Nation schools. To date, we've collected data on over 330,000 kindergarten children in BC since 2001. As you can see, we group data collection periods into waves, which encompasses 2 to 3 years. We invite school districts to participate in waves depending on their size. Smaller districts may participate more frequently to ensure that the number of children covered in each neighborhood is large enough to be reliable and to track meaningful change over time. Whereas large districts participate only once in a 3-year wave. Today, we're reviewing the Wave 8 EDI data. And this school year, we're starting data collection for Wave 9. Wave 8 data collection took place over 3 school years, so from 2009 to 2022. Data are collected in February of the school year. And as you can see on the slide, in year 1, data were collected just prior to the WHO declaration of the pandemic, so pre-pandemic, and years 2 and 3 took place mid-pandemic. Over time, we've seen a very high participation rate in the EDI in BC. And despite all of the challenges over the last couple of years, Wave 8 was no exception with an 88% participation rate. This rate is lower than Wave 7, which was 94%, but it's similar to participation rate from past waves. The EDI Wave participation rate is the percentage of kindergarten children for whom an EDI questionnaire was completed by their teacher out of all the kindergarten children enrolled in the school districts involved in data collection. Unlike many jurisdictions across Canada, BC managed to keep schools open for all but a few weeks during this extraordinary time. And EDI and the other child development monitoring system data about the health and well-being of children and youth in BC were able to be collected during this time. We want to take this opportunity to say thank you to our education, health, and community colleagues that worked so hard to make this happen. All right, let's dig into Wave 8 data, starting with overall vulnerability in BC. This graph shows the trend line from Wave 2, which were data collected from 2004 to 7, to Wave 8 on the summary measure vulnerable on one or more scales. This reports the percentage of children who are vulnerable on at least one EDI scale, but many may be experiencing vulnerabilities in 2, 3, 4, or even all 5 scales. You can see that in Wave 8, 32.9% of kindergarten children were vulnerable on one or more scales of the EDI. Research has shown that children who are vulnerable on the EDI without care and support are more likely to experience difficulties in their school years and beyond. Over the long term, there has been a meaningful increase in overall vulnerability rates, rising from 29.9% in Wave 2 to 32.9% in this latest wave. To determine a meaningful change, HELP uses a method called critical differences to indicate if the change in rates between 2 points in time is both statistically significant and large enough to be worth talking about. And over the long term, this increase has been meaningful. Over the short term, the overall vulnerability rate went down slightly from 33.4% in Wave 8 to 32.9% in Wave 7 to 32.9% in Wave 8. But this trend is considered stable. As in Wave 7, there are still 1 in 3 children starting school vulnerable in at least one developmental area, important to their future success in school and beyond. This figure breaks down the vulnerability rates to show how many scales children are vulnerable on, or what we call multiple vulnerabilities. Over time, from Wave 2 to Wave 8, you can see along the top of this graph is the trend line of the rates of children vulnerable on 1 or more scales. It's the same trend line we saw in the previous graph. Then each section of the bar graph breaks down the percentage of children who are vulnerable on just one EDI scale. So that's the lightest color you can see at the bottom. Then the percentage who are vulnerable on 2, 3, 4, and 5 EDI scales, and the colors get darker as you go up. Notable here is that the proportion of children with multiple vulnerabilities has gone up over time. When we add up the percentage of children vulnerable on 2 or more scales, there's been an increase from 16% in Wave 2 to 19.5% in Wave 8 of children with multiple vulnerabilities. This suggests that in addition to increased rates of overall vulnerability in BC over the long term, the complexity of vulnerability has also increased. In the past EDI data reporting, the focus has been on highlighting rates of developmental vulnerability in populations of children. However, the EDI measures the whole distribution of children's outcomes, allowing us to understand areas of strength and potential across the 5 key areas of development. And for the first time, HELP is incorporating the full range of outcomes in our reporting for Wave 8. Here we see the icons representing the 5 scales of the EDI along the top and the explanations for the 3 overall outcome measures. So we just reviewed the trends for overall vulnerability, which is the percentage of children who are vulnerable on one or more scales of the EDI. But we also have overall on track, which is the percentage of children who are developmentally on track across all 5 scales of the EDI. These children are most likely to have successful trajectories in school and beyond. And the overall influx measure is the percentage of children in the middle. They're neither vulnerable on one or more EDI scale, nor are they on track on all 5 scales. These children are considered to be in flux and may or may not catch up to their on-track peers and may benefit from additional supports. Here we see the overall vulnerability rates we just shared from wave 2 to wave 8, and now we can add the overall on-track and overall influx rates over time. What we see is that in wave 8, while almost half of the children, or 45.4%, were on track in all 5 areas of development, 32.9% were vulnerable in one or more areas of development, and another 21.8% were in flux. We're going to dig into geographic differences. Here is the overall provincial picture of vulnerability on one or more scales across the province for wave 8 by school district. This is a heat map, so the darker the red, the higher the overall vulnerability rates, and the lighter pink or white areas would indicate lower rates. What is most evident from this map is that there continues to be a significant disparity in vulnerability rates across the province. At the school district level, the range in overall vulnerability rate goes from 21.8 at the lowest end to 72% at the highest end. So take a moment to consider what this means at the school district level. What extra supports that may be needed in the community that has just 22% of their kindergarten children arriving with developmental vulnerabilities, compared with a district with 72% of its kindergarten children arriving with vulnerabilities. When we look at the neighborhood level, the difference is even more pronounced. For wave 8, the range goes from a neighborhood with 13.2% overall vulnerability to an all-out high of 72%. This demonstrates that children's developmental outcomes are impacted by where they live in the province. The graph you see here is showing the range in overall vulnerability rates over time, from wave 2 to wave 8. So that line in the middle is what you've seen on a few different graphs. Now, each dot on the graph represents one of the 298 help neighborhoods and where they sit in the range for each wave of data collection. You can see the wave 8 neighborhood range highlighted in gray that I just mentioned, the 13.2 to 72%. Notably here is that over the past 4 waves, the overall vulnerability rates have increased at both the lowest and highest ends of the range. From the wave 5 range of 4.3 at the lowest to 56.4 at the highest end of the range, then increasing each wave. Wave 8 has, in fact, the highest percentages at both the lowest and the highest ends of the range of any wave so far. This is also showing that while there has been a stable trend in overall vulnerability rates between wave 7 and wave 8 at the provincial level, when you look at the community and the neighborhood level, there is real variability in outcomes and experiences. And we look forward to releasing the community and neighborhood level data in the new year so these differences can be explored more thoroughly. At the bottom here, we see that wave 8 neighborhood ranges for on track and influx So for on track, it goes from a neighborhood with just 7.5% of children on track on all areas of development up to a neighborhood with 71.4% of children on track on their overall development. Another new item that we've included in Wave 8 reporting is a look at different neighborhood types, comparing rural and urban with neighborhood to neighborhood overall outcomes for Wave 8. So a neighborhood that is classified as urban it would have a population of at least 1,000 people and a population density of at least 400 people per square kilometer. Otherwise, it is classified as rural for this analysis. Here we see that in Wave 8, the rates for overall on track, in flux, and vulnerable are quite similar between these neighborhood types, with children in urban neighborhoods having a slightly higher overall vulnerability rate of 33.4% than children in rural neighborhoods at 32.1%. Over time, children living in rural neighborhoods have had consistently lower overall vulnerability rates than children living in urban neighborhoods across all waves of the EDI. However, this difference has become smaller over time, decreasing from a difference of about 4 percentage points in the earliest waves to just over 1 percentage point in recent waves. Okay, we're going to dig into EDI scales and subscales. So you've seen the overall outcomes, which provide a summary of the developmental health of kindergarten children. But now we have more specific information about each area of development that we can look at when we see each of the scale and subscale levels. And again, we're introducing the new reporting metrics and how they're determined at the scale level. At the scale level, the full distribution of outcome measures the percentage of children that are considered vulnerable, at risk, and on track on each scale of the EDI. At the scale level, children whose scores are below the 10% cutoff score on a scale are considered vulnerable on that area of development. Children whose scores are between 10 and 25% cutoff scores are considered at risk in that area of development. And children who score above the 25% cutoff are considered on track in that specific area of development measured by that scale. Here is what the distribution of outcomes at the scale level looks like across the 5 scales of the EDI for Wave 8. You can see that most children are on track in their development on each scale of the EDI. The highest on track rates are on the language and cognitive development scales at 78.4% of children, and the communication skills and general knowledge scale with 75.3%. While the lowest on track rates is for emotional maturity, with 67% of children on track in their development. Now, focusing on vulnerability rates, we see the flip with the emotional maturity scale having the highest vulnerability rate at 17.5%, and the language and cognitive development with lowest at 10.5%. At this point, for trends over time, we're only reporting the vulnerability rates at the scale level, as we can use the critical difference methodology to determine meaningful change across time. Over the long term, between Wave 2 and Wave 8, 3 of the 5 EDI scales, so physical health and well-being, social competence, and emotional maturity, had meaningful increases in vulnerability. The other 2 scales, language and cognitive development and communication skills and general knowledge, have had stable long-term trends. And language and cognitive development has been the scale with the lowest vulnerability rates across all of the waves. Over the short term, between Wave 7 and Wave 8, all 5 scales had stable trends. And this is what the trends in a scale level vulnerability look like in relation to one another. Pulling out a couple of trends for deeper conversation, you can see that the emotional maturity scale increased steadily from wave 2 to wave 7 with a stable trend over the short term. And for the third wave in a row, the emotional maturity and social competence scales had the highest vulnerability rates of all 5 scales. These 2 scales are associated. Wave 8 data show that of the 8% of children who were vulnerable on 2 EDI scales, 42.5% were vulnerable on both social competence and emotional maturity scales combined. This is concerning, given that these scales measure behaviors related to the most common childhood mental health issues. These findings, unfortunately, are in line with other research showing increased incidences of mental health concerns for children across Canada. What we also know from the research is that there is an association between social emotional functioning and physician-assessed mental health conditions by age 14. We know that children demonstrating vulnerabilities and social and emotional functioning in kindergarten, based on the EDI, were more likely to have mental health conditions 10 years later, and that there is a pattern of progression that starts as early as age 5. This research illustrates how EDI can be used to monitor population patterns in childhood mental health and inform further research into interventions that target modifiable factors between or before mental health conditions become fully developed. Another interesting scale level trend to point out that while all scales had stable trends between wave 7 and wave 8, the physical health and well-being scale decreased the most over the short term than any of the other scales. Though this was not a meaningful change, but it dropped from 15.4% to 14.7%. The physical health and well-being scale is the EDI scale most associated with family socioeconomic status. Here we see a graph of the subscale trends for physical health and well-being. All scales except communication skills are made up of a set of subscales. There is much more detail available in the Provincial Summary that you can explore when it is released. What we want to point out here is that the subscales can provide useful data for understanding the trends that we see at the scale level. So physical health and well-being has 3 subscales: gross and fine motor skills, physical independence, which includes items about washroom independence and coordination, and physical readiness for the school day, which includes items about being dressed appropriately for school activities, coming to school tired, late, or hungry, items which we can relate to family socioeconomic status in terms of families being able to afford to send children to school well-fed and appropriately dressed. On this slide is a graph of 3 subscales. The subscale graphs show trend in the subscales over time and in comparison to the BC average that was established in wave 2. What you're paying attention to here is if the trend line for the subscale is going up, the trend is getting worse. If the line is going down, the trend is getting better. Here you can see that gross and fine motor skills has seen improvement over the long term. Physical independence has worsening trends over the long term. And physical readiness for the school day subscale has had some variability over time, with worsening trends over the long term. However, over the short term, it has meaningfully improved, associated with a decrease in vulnerability at the scale level between wave 7 and wave 8. So that brings us to the end of the EDI Wave 8 data presentation. We've covered a lot of ground. So EDI data are being actively used by multiple systems, organizations, and policymakers across the province. And on our new website, you can find information on how EDI and other child developmental monitoring system data have been used to good effect over the years. As a small sample of this, at the provincial government policy and investment level, EDI data are used as central indicators in current policy documents like BC's first ever poverty reduction strategy, a pathway to hope, mental health strategy document, and as part of the advocacy story in terms of the move towards a universal childcare system in BC. EDI data are used across the province by community and regional coalitions and across sectors for planning and action purposes, and have informed hundreds of programs and services for children and families over the years. HELP couldn't do any of this work without our partners across the province, like many of you on here today. Thank you. Thank you deeply. So we've covered a lot of ground. And to give you the high-level summary of key findings, there are still 1 in 3 kindergarten children in BC that are vulnerable on one or more core area of development important to their future success. Social competence and emotional maturity continue to be the scales with the highest vulnerability rates, and that is very concerning. There continues to be a disparity in overall vulnerability rates at the community and neighborhood level in BC. Now that brings us to the end of the EDI Wave 8 data review. I'm going to turn it over to Kate Boom now to start off the next section of our webinar, Reflection from Helpers.
Thank you, Mariana. Indeed, there was a lot of data covered. And we're going to go right now. My name is Kate Boom. I'm a senior knowledge broker with the Knowledge to Action team here at HELP. And we're going to transition now to the reflection section of the webinar. And as we do that, we would like to hear from you. What are your reflections on what you just heard, on what you will hear coming up? As you have those reflections or comments, please share them in the chat. Continue to put your questions in the Q&A. I can see we've got lots of dialogue going on there. So questions in the Q&A. Reflections in the chat. And we hope that at the end we'll have some time to share some of the reflections that have been shared with us in the chat. So I'm going to start us off with the reflections, and then I'm going to turn it over to 2 HELP faculty members. So this reflection is about the stable trend in EDI vulnerability rates between Wave 7 and Wave 8, which is perhaps surprising given the immense disruption caused by the pandemic during this time. At HELP, we were also surprised, and the analysis team looked very closely at the data. I mean, as they always do, but particularly this time, with an eye to make sure that we were confident to report that there was a stable trend and not something unusual as a result of the pandemic. And we were confident to report the stable trend at that provincial level. The Wave 8 data that was just presented is provincial, population level picture. And we can see through that range in vulnerability that Mariana went through at the school district and a neighborhood level, that the story varies greatly across the province, and we'll be able to learn more when we release that community and neighborhood level data, and we'll have more conversations about that data at that time. Data collected through the other child development monitoring system tools during this same period, so data collected through CHECK, MDI, and YDI, broaden the story about the impact of the pandemic on the experiences, health, and well-being of children, youth, and adults in BC, including parents and caregivers through the CHECK reporting experiences like less consistent childcare, feeling less connected to family and friends, the impact on work and family income. Through the MDI, data collected from students themselves in grades 4 through 8, there were declines over time from the pre-pandemic 2019 to 2022 in terms of children's self-reported well-being and in terms of the presence of assets in their lives. And you can read more about this. We have a news article on our website, and the link for that article will be shared in the chat if you want to read more. The other point to make is that many of the youngest infants and toddlers born and developing during the pandemic have not yet entered the school system. And we may see different impacts on this group that didn't have the routine and stability of the education system like the kids in Wave 8 did during this period. So these younger children will be involved in future waves of EDI data collection, and we may see some different trends in this group with that long reach of the pandemic. Previous research using EDI data have demonstrated that there is a strong relationship between family and neighborhood socioeconomic status and vulnerability rates. So this graph shows the relationship between quintiles on the HELP SES index, socioeconomic status index created by Dr. Barry Four at HELP, and Wave 8 EDI vulnerability rates for BC. So it's showing that there is a gradient in outcomes. Children living in families and neighborhoods with lower SES are more likely to have higher rates of vulnerability than children living in higher SES families and neighborhoods. And there's a 15 percentage point difference in those vulnerability rates from the lowest to the highest. So it suggests that the barriers and the challenges faced by families living in low incomes, with low incomes and in low income neighborhoods, whether those struggles are meeting basic needs or access to safe and stable housing or finding appropriate childcare, that these stressors can impact children's early experiences and in turn over time their development. So the point we're making here, what we're highlighting, is that there's certainly more nuance to that provincial level stable trend at the neighborhood and family level. However, maybe the stable trend offers a glimpse of a good news story, considering that that stable trend happened during a global pandemic and myriad of other large-scale challenges in BC and beyond, like climate change-related wildfires, heat domes, floods, an opioid crisis, etc. So since the last release of EDI data, Wave 7 in 2019, there have been a number of changes in government policy and investments, both federally and provincially, in support of children and families. And these are policies that HELP and partners across the province have been championing as necessary for many years. To give a few examples of these changes and investments, at the provincial level, BC's moved toward universal, affordable, accessible childcare. BC's adoption of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act and related action plan released 2022. BC's first ever poverty reduction plan. And at the federal level, there's been increases to the Canada Child Benefit, more than one increase, an extension of parental leave to 18 months, and a commitment to and a $30 billion investment in a national childcare system. So to be clear, this is not to say that all targets and promises and needs have been met. We're good now. The point we're making here is that there have been some very significant significant policy shifts since Wave 7 in the right direction to support children and families. Moreover, in response to the pandemic, the Government of Canada and provinces provided income relief programs on a scale similar to a guaranteed basic income, major social investments. In fact, Canada ranked 4th of the G20 countries for pandemic relief spending. 68% of Canadian adults received income from one or more pandemic relief programs. And in BC, it was 74.5% of adults, which was the highest in the country. Newly released census data show that between 2015 and 2020, income inequality fell in all provinces and territories. And in 2020, low income rates fell, especially for families with children, largely driven by government transfers. So what we're saying here is that perhaps at a population level, and that's the important part, these policies and investments acted as a buffer or had some kind of stabilizing effect, preventing vulnerability rates from continuing that long-term worsening trend, even during a challenging period. It should be noted that the census data as it's coming out right now was collected during the pandemic when these relief programs were active. So we know that they are no longer active and that now we're facing new challenges as things continuously change. Serious inflation in the cost of basic needs is certainly something we're all thinking about now. So ultimately, research is needed. And the good news is in progress that explores the relationship between large-scale policies and investments like the ones outlined here and children's development and well-being. And we look forward to what we learn and sharing what we learn as we go. So that brings me to the end of my reflection. And I'm going to turn it over now to HELP faculty, Dr. Brenda Poon, to provide the next commentary.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here to share with you my reflection on some of the results that we heard today. For those of you that know me, my name is Brenda Poon. I'm a pretty long-time faculty member with HELP, and I feel really privileged to have had the opportunity to work with my lab and partners to really explore community systems and better understand community-level determinants that may be impacting childhood vulnerability. And today what I thought I'd do is reflect on some of the trends that we're seeing in relationship to social competence and emotional maturity, and how they connect with some of the current and ongoing work in my lab. Kate's helping me drive today. So next, please, Kate. Thank you. So as we saw earlier, we are seeing meaningful increases in vulnerability. We see that these scales are contributing highest vulnerability rates of all the 5 scales. Now, this is something that it's a pattern and set of trends that really influenced the conversations that I was having probably about 4 or 5 years ago with various communities about the potential to build some partnerships on research that we could do that would lead to some better understanding of what some of the factors are that could be driving some of the rise in social and emotional vulnerability rates in each community. So what was common was that the communities that I spoke to and worked with had a shared concern about this increasing trend or this worsening trend in vulnerability. And this led to some of the partnered projects that I'll touch upon today. As well, what contributed to this work was the observation of the geographic disparities that we're observing over time. And we really did recognize the importance of considering context and wanting to further understand and dig much deeper into what's happening both within and across communities. Next, please. So about the same time, about 3 or 4 years ago, we established my lab, which is the Community Research and Engagement Lab, or CORE Lab. And really the aim is to understand from communities' perspectives, from their experiences, what could be key drivers to vulnerability. And also consider the importance of community context and the impacts of that, the influence of that on child development. It was really a way to explore what was similar across community perspectives about what's driving vulnerability, as well as also try and understand the combination of characteristics that could be contributing as well in terms of a constellation or interconnection of factors. Generally, the lab, CORE Lab, prioritizes research community partnerships, and really we hope to co-design with community research that helps to address some kind of knowledge gap and inform plans for action. So in relationship to social and emotional vulnerability, to better understand community perspectives and lived experiences, we focused on projects that would help us to first identify some key variables within the system that could be influencing children's social and emotional vulnerabilities from the perspectives of those residing in that community. And with that, a second objective was to develop a shared understanding of community or place-specific determinants that could really be used to mobilize community planning and action. Next, please. So one of our early activities in our project was to map systems influencing childhood vulnerability across communities. And through a process called group model building, we developed what's here, which is a very simplified form of something called the causal loop diagram. And we engaged with community partners. And in this case, the partners were mostly within the child and family serving or support structures and organizations across sectors in the early years. And we engaged in multiple sessions with communities over time to really identify variable by variable what communities' perspectives on what could be driving increases in vulnerability and social and emotional well-being. Now, we didn't want to stop in terms of the group model to just look at individual variables. So it was really important for us to dig deeply into the interconnections between variables as well. And I said this is a very simplified version, one small quadrant of a very huge systems map, and also with variables removed for illustration purposes. But just to give you a sense of some of the variables that were emerging and the process that we engaged to better understand the interplay of determinants. Next, click, please. So once we went through the process of identifying various factors, we could see that there were certain clusters or themes in terms of how variables sort of hung together. So for example, in the red, our groups highlighted stressors around parent caregiver stress and anxiety, for example, as being a direct impact on child anxiety. We also move up a layer in green, and we noted that there were variables that communities put forward that were really related to community. So in this case, community services. We also knew that there were other variables that related to the family's interaction with those services, which are those reflected in the yellow. As well, we saw the interconnections with policy and government reflected in blue. So this was a way for us to really see multiple levels of influence across different spheres of influence. And what this did was not only give us sort of a sense of the complexity of the interplay of factors that could be influencing childhood social emotional vulnerability, but in a sense, we wanted to use it as a roadmap as well to really guide the next phases of our research together. So we were looking at ways that we could understand community-identified stressors that are facing families, and at the same time, identify what could be important from a community's perspective, what could be feasible from our community partners' perspectives that we could move forward plans for action and research. Next, please. So one of the ways that we wanted to guide our roadmap was to talk to our community partners. And across the communities that we spoke to, parent and caregiver stress and anxiety was a central variable across each of the systems maps that we developed. Now, what we wanted to do was use that as a starting point for further exploration. Click, please, Kate. So that's where we identified this particular cluster of the systems map as a priority area that we could delve into further through our partners' research. And as we started to continue, or as we continued our consultations, we were hearing from our partners about some of the stressors that they were experiencing. Families feeling disconnected and isolated, experiencing economic stressors and trying to meet basic needs, accessing healthy foods, accessing housing, for example. Families feeling overwhelmed with competing priorities. Some families feeling a sense of distrust and a sense of disconnect in terms of belongingness in their communities. And some families just not feeling quite safe enough to become connected with others, whether that's other families or with services and supports that were in their community. And that was also tied to some feelings of stigma that could be introduced with accessing certain services. So, for example, food-related services that were associated with some feelings of embarrassment or shame, having an impact on that connectedness with supports. So that was one cluster that was of interest to our community partners. Another cluster, click please, Kate. And one more click, thanks, was another part of our system that's interconnected again, but focuses on a little bit of a different aspect of a stressor that's impacting families' access to community supports. And in this way, we really highlighted, or the communities really highlighted, some of the impacts on stability and consistency of the care environment, the stability of those support services, and ways that that's connected to families' access to community supports and services. So we see that consistency, for example, in services and supports is impacted by wait lists and shortages out there. Also, in terms of service provider retention, it's something that we've heard from some of our partners and community about this feeling from providers feeling burned out, the turnover having impact, how that in itself creates a disconnect with families, disconnect with each other, limitations in relationship building in the current context, growing mistrust in some cases between some organizations. And that was very much tied with a sense of competition for staff and also competition for a small pool of funding that also has the implications of creating tension. Also the necessity to work in multiple capacities. So people, the staff out there needing to wear multiple hats, have multiple roles in order to just keep doors open. So there's a sense in cases that we're hearing about crises related to just the shortage of supports out there, single provider needing to serve multiple communities, and all of this coming together to create difficulties in access and stressors for families. So between those two areas is just two short examples of where communities have guided us in conversations about where we could go with our co-designed research. Next, please, Kate. So what we do, as I said, that those types of systems act as roadmaps for us in determining our partnerships for research to action. So where do we have gaps in knowledge that, if filled, could help us move forward in our work with children and families? So just by example, we do this with every community, but just by example, some that have been highlighted that relate to the cluster areas that I showed you in the past slides are around what is promoting or preventing individuals and organizations from connecting with each other and with supports in the community. And also important to a number of our communities partners as well is how do we connect with the disconnected? That could be geographic, could be newcomers to the community. How do we connect those families to supports and to the community itself? When we co-design the research questions or co-design the methodology as well, the idea is that when we complete the research is that we can meet some desired outcomes and objectives. So we hope that by doing this partnered research together, we can produce knowledge that can help to not only identify barriers, but also remove them as well, particularly for those children and families that are experiencing isolation. We hope that we can also build on community strengths. So how do we enhance that? Can we enhance that connectedness? Can we enhance access to supports, strengthen community capacity? Can we also support staff retention as well? And can we have an impact on reducing some of the stigma related to support seeking? So this is the phase of work that we're engaged in right now, working closely with our community partners on designing this research and coming up with ideas of how we can really mobilize knowledge to some action. Next, please, Kate. Just to close and share with you, if you're interested in this work at all, we recently published a couple papers. So if you'd like to learn about the methodology that we use, the community partnerships that we've developed to design these systems maps, please do. You're welcome to get in touch with me or refer to these. And next, please, Kate. And I just want to close by thanking, first and foremost, our community partners who maybe you're on this call or on this webinar. I'm just really grateful for your work with us together. And definitely my team members as well, Chris Atchison and Ali Bruder, who are part of Core Lab, and our funders as well from SSHRC and from the Vancouver Foundation. Thanks for this opportunity to share my reflection. And with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Barry Forer.
Oh, here I am. Yes. Hi there, everybody. Thank you for being part of this webinar and this momentous occasion where we can talk about a new wave of EDI data. I'm a research methodologist at HELP. I've been at HELP since before Wave 2, over 20 years, I think, or around 20 years. And I'm currently the scientific lead for both the EDI and CHEC at HELP. And I'm going to focus my short reflection on mixing in early childhood contexts and experiences into the mix with EDI scores, and with specifically focusing on one of our other tools, which is the CHEC. So maybe next slide, please. Just going back to our diagrams that kind of visualize how we see the context that influence children's trajectories, with children at the middle, and then working out through families where they live, and then larger and larger regions till we get to the whole world. We don't have the universe yet, but I think eventually we'll need to have it. But in order to really understand trajectories completely, we really need information at all these different levels. And probably the closer you come to the children, you need even more information. Of course, on children and families, that's where you need the most information and where there's the most variability. But with the global pandemic, obviously the global environment has played a role in recent years in terms of children's trajectories, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. Next, please. Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to focus on the CHEC and the EDI. The CHEC will have its own webinar, I think, eventually, because it's coming along with, we have quite a few children who have CHEC scores now, and quite a few linkages as well. And the nice thing about CHEC is that it adds a whole other dimension to the kind of information that we have. With EDI, we really only have some really limited information about children's characteristics. We know their age and their gender and whether they've been designated special needs or English language learners, but we have no SES information about them other than the kinds of information we can get about their neighborhood SES from things like census. But CHEC adds a whole nother dimension about the important things, the differences that make a difference, as we've talked about a few times, and specifically what parents and caregivers report about the experiences and contexts that the children have had at the point when they're about to enter the school system. And we also use that opportunity to gather information about some of the socioeconomic context at that family level, which is really important. So for CHEC and EDI, we currently have about a little over 5,000 children where we have linked scores for CHEC and EDI. For the last 3 years, 2019 to 2021, the CHEC is collected in September, just before as it says there, just before kids start kindergarten, from parents and caregivers. And we don't have CHEC scores on all the children with EDI scores, only about half of them. And that's because we're still trying to work on having the same kind of high participation rates with CHEC as we do with EDI. And we are moving towards trying to ensure that school districts collect CHEC and EDI in the same year so we can link them up. But in the earlier days, it was harder to do that. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. So what do we capture in CHEC? We have 5 domains, and if you can see that they kind of track quite closely with the domains and the competencies that we capture in the EDI for good purposes. I know social and emotional, language and cognition, health and well-being, those are all things that are covered in the EDI, but we also get some information about the experiences and context beyond just those domains, including something about early learning and childcare and community context around neighborhood safety and things like that. And so that actually is a lot of information that we gather, many items, and one of the big challenges for CHEC is how to kind of find ways of summarizing all this information in ways that people can really understand and use. And we do make very good use of CHEC in our e-system. As soon as parents fill out the CHEC, that information is collated and made available to people in the school system. And everyone from individual teachers can get information about their individual students in their classroom through administrators, community, and researchers on all of these things. So what I'm going to show you today are, picking and choosing a few little tidbits to show you about some of the patterns that that we can see between CHEC and EDI for the 5,300 or so children for whom we have the linked data. And I'll have to explain a few things as I go. So let's go to the next one. Thank you. So as I was mentioning, there's lots of different items in across the different domains of CHEC, and we have to find ways of summarizing them so they're useful. And we've created these 5 composite scores: physical activity, sleep and nutrition, talking about emotions, language and cognition, and peer experiences. And what we've gone through a whole process, those of you who know the MDI might see some similarities here, about taking a number of items and really kind of ending up for a whole composite with three possible scores. In this case, for just give an example of language and cognition, whether a child has had just a few experiences around language and cognition. This is things like parents reading to children or doing puzzles with them or play, creative play. So a few experiences up to many experiences. So we kind of create a three score composite for each of these five. And what you can see in this chart here is that across all five of these composite scores, which are, by the way, are given to teachers so they can see them for their individual students right away as soon as the school year starts. You see as you go from just to have children who have just a few experiences up to having many experiences, the overall vulnerability rate goes down quite a bit. And just to pick one, for example, language and cognition, for those relatively few children whose household experiences around language and cognition are only a few, almost half of them are vulnerable on one or more scales, compared to 24% of children who are in households with many language and cognition experiences. So that's a huge difference. The one place where you don't see this kind of nice, easy downward trend is on talking about emotions. These are questions about how often parents can talk with their children about their positive and negative interactions with other children, or about their emotions and feelings, or parents talking about their own emotions and feelings. And you can actually see something here where it looks like maybe too many experiences might not be better than having a medium amount of experiences. So this is how we summarize a lot of the questions into these kind of five areas, but there's more to the check than that. And maybe the next slide will be interesting here. Lots of bars to look at, but just to tell you what this is a question about how much screen time the child spends by themselves, and it's broken down both by the household income, and it shows the vulnerability rates. And maybe if we just focus on what the pattern looks like, if you kind of look from left to right, what you see is that generally speaking, the vulnerability rates get smaller and smaller as the income for the household gets bigger and bigger. But within each one of those income groups, there's a tendency for children's vulnerability to get worse as there's more time spent with a child looking at a screen by himself or herself. So you see both something that reflects the socioeconomic relationship on screen time, as well as something about the actual variable itself. It has great consequences for how much vulnerability children show. For the under 50,000 families, it's the only one where you don't see exactly the same pattern. I would suggest that at a certain level, you have more vulnerability with less screen time, maybe because they don't have the screens to look at. Okay, down to the next one, please. So I'm going to show something here about the next one is, that's it. Okay. I'm going to kind of focus on one area. Remember the community context, and I'll show you a pattern and try to relate it maybe a bit to potentially something about COVID. One of the areas of the check asks about community resources, and they're asked how often the child used a number of different community resources. They're asked about each one of these things, from sports programs through Strong Start, through libraries, and so on. And then the key question, in the last year, were there any local activities that you wanted to do with the child but were not able to? And if yes, what stopped you from participating? And then there's a list of about 10 or so reasons why parents might say that they couldn't participate the way they wanted to. And it turns out about half and half over the 3 years where we have linked data, but half of those families said that they didn't have any barriers, and about half said they did have some barriers. And so we're going to just look at what we see around EDI outcomes for that. And what we see is, and this is, you'll see that these are the 5 EDI scales at the bottom, and then overall being vulnerable on one or more scales. What you see for most of the scales is that those families that said that they did have one or more barriers to participating in some of these local community activities had higher vulnerability rates overall than those who didn't. That was true for physical health and well-being, social competence, emotional maturity, and overall. On language and cognitive development or communication skills, we didn't see this trend, excuse me, in terms of having barriers to community activities. But, and this is my last slide, what's really interesting is if we focus on the 27% with no barriers overall and the 30% with one or more barriers, and break them up into break up the 3 years into the first year, which was pre-COVID, and the next 2 years where we have linked data, which were during COVID, you see a difference in the patterns. I just want to give a huge number of caveats about this. First of all, we're still trying to work on provincial coverage with CHEC. We don't have information from all school districts. The participation rates are not as high for EDI, so people are missing for a variety of reasons I talked about. And so, it's the comparisons are not necessarily apples to apples as much as we would like them to be. But it's interesting to see something here. And that is when you look at overall, there's a 3 percentage point difference that's associated with having some barriers to participating in local activities. But if you think pre-COVID, you get something where it's 6 percentage points difference. So you see a stronger effect there. And only 34% pre-COVID said that they had one or more of these barriers. When you get to the 2 years of COVID, it's up to twice as many, 69% having at least one barrier. And the gradient that we've seen goes away. So that's very interesting, suggestive only, I would say. But it seems like maybe no surprise that some things that are one of the things that make a difference maybe don't show up as easily when there are even bigger things that make a difference for everybody. So I think that's one of the take homes of this. And there are so many different things that I'd love to show you about CHEC and EDI, or just CHEC, but that'll have to wait for a future webinar, I think. In the meantime, thank you very much for this. I look forward to your questions if you have any, and take it away, Kate.
Thanks, Barry. Actually, I'm going to call up Joanne and Mariana.
Thanks, Kate. Thank you to Mariana and Dwayne and Brenda and Kate and Barry for all of those reflections. I think we can take a little breath just to share with all of you. We really had so much information we wanted to share with you. So we wanted to make sure we were marching along and leave a little bit of time for reflections. And we have a little bit, so that's fantastic. So we can catch our breath. I would really encourage you to, if you have leftover questions, put them in the Q&A. We have a few minutes to talk about them. And also, if you just have any reflections about what we have talked about today, if you can throw them into the chat, it's really helpful for us to just collect the reflections that all of you have. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Joanne Schroeder. I'm the Director of Strategy and Innovation at HELP. Like Barry, I have been around at HELP for many years, and so really celebrating this 20 years of EDI data. Marianne, I have a few things to capture from what we've been talking about, but I wanted to create some space for you if you wanted to add any reflections before we move into that stage.
Thank you so much, Joanne. It's been interesting watching the questions and the reflections that have come through in the chat and the Q&A. And really what struck me kind of big picture is just how interested our various partners are in these data and how you seem to look to these data to provide directions in the kinds of work that you need to do. And I'm also, I like some of what I see in terms of people making connections to different different aspects of their work and other work that they've encountered, like the 40 developmental assets. So just keep it coming. It's been very interesting. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mariana. Just kind of a brief reflection for me. Kate referred to it in terms of, I suppose, a little bit of a collective surprise for those of us at HELP when we saw that the Wave 8 data showed a stable trend from Wave 7. We were anticipating, I suppose, something a little bit different in the shadow of the pandemic. And we've said about the EDI for many years, I think. It doesn't give us sometimes direct answers, but it gives us better questions. And I think, as we now have this Wave 8 data to work with, we have lots of questions, lots of directions to go to. There were a few questions as we went along about, the impact of some of the policy initiatives that were introduced during the pandemic. Did they have positive impact? And Kate shared a little bit of her musings about that. They are recommendations around providing adequate income levels for people, providing, access to quality childcare, allowing parents to find ways to balance home and work. These are things we've been recommending for many years. And with the pandemic, those kinds of initiatives came forth in a way that probably we could have never orchestrated, not to minimize the negative trauma and grief that many people suffered during the pandemic. But those policy initiatives, hopefully we learned something about how they have been positively impacting on families that will guide our policymakers going forward in terms of that. So I wanted to reflect a little bit on that one. There were a couple of questions too as we went along about the whole concept of vulnerability. How do we understand what vulnerability is? How do we determine it? And there was one comment about, doesn't using a vulnerability measure point to more of an individual deficit rather than the systemic and structural contributions to children's outcomes that we know are, really what we're trying to learn about. I really appreciated that comment. I can't remember off the top of my head where it came from or who shared it, but just to really agree with that, and that as we go forth and talk about these results, to really, keep on directing people back to those concentric circles that both Mariana and Barry shared in terms of the layers of influence on children's development. And that, the EDI is a reflection of the quality of experiences that children have had before they get to kindergarten in their neighborhoods, with the services that they access or the barriers that they have to accessing those services. So so it's something to really think about. And I particularly think about it in respect to how we understand the outcomes for children in particular population groups, children who are living in poverty, children who are new to Canada, Indigenous children. These are groups that are impacted by our colonial structures and systems in an inequitable way. And we would always want to raise that it is the systemic and structural contributions that we want to focus on and work together with all of you. So I'm rambling a bit there, Mariana. Anything to chime in on? I'm going to just check at the next. Oh, Kate is answering the question. Thank you, Kate. Anything else that you'd like to add there, Mariana?
Well, just that I think also what's been helpful about this webinar is some of the questions that you've been asking will help us direct our analyses as we dig into the community and neighborhood level data. But also don't be too worried that you missed something today, because the report itself will be released imminently. And it's very interactive, and you can dig into each of the charts and graphs and break the data down the way that is helpful for you to see, so that you can reflect more on it. And also encourage you to look back at our website in early in next year in 2023, so in just a month or two, because we will have an interactive dashboard with the data so that you can do some of your own digging and analyses that will get you further into the community and neighborhood level. I suspect that once you see those data, as we've seen today, more questions will be raised rather than answers. And what we find particularly helpful at Help with our own work is to hear from you what those questions are, because that also helps us direct our attentions and the work that we do to figure out, okay, so how can we help you do your job? So really appreciating all of the questions and comments that are coming through as we speak.
Thank you. I see a question about social emotional development, and I'm maybe going to call on Brenda to just reflect for a minute or two before we head off on what they have been learning about the kinds of things that support children's social emotional development. We've often said, it helped very simply, play, talk, cuddle are the way to support children's development in all of its in a holistic way. But Brenda, I don't know if you want to we just got a couple minutes to just chime in about what does support children's social emotional development.
Well, I think through our systems mapping, we find that communities are able to share just across multi-level determinants, really multi-levels of spheres of influence, everything from child level onward. And I think for us, in identifying what some of the key pathways are is essential, because I know that when we talk about interventions, the importance of family level supports are there, and intervening early for sure, and having those supports in place across sectors. But I think we're also learning more about the layers that influence that. So what are some of the factors that contribute to families being able to participate in some of those supports and programs that are available? What's coming from the level of community organizing and capacity that influences what's available? And then above that, in terms of structural investments into programs and services available, that may differ by community. So really trying to understand how there are also great differences in terms of what's impacting our communities, the importance of the interplay of the context with sort of the needs, as well as the resources that are available to that community in addressing those needs. So I think there's not really an easy answer, especially from me with the lens of looking at the multiple levels, but I certainly see every layer. But through this work, definitely the interconnection has become at the very forefront of needing to look across levels and sectors and disciplines.
Thanks so much, Brenda.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, that is, I think that's one that all of us, are continually struggling with. These are complex solutions, and we'd all like to have that magic bullet, but really trying to together understand the complexity of that is so important. So Kate, I think we're down to just a couple minutes. Maybe you can put up our more to unpack what's next. So we've touched a little bit on the SES data today, but as we get more of our neighborhood-based SES data, really digging into what is the relationship from a neighborhood to neighborhood level around socioeconomic factors, and really continuing our linkage to other administrative data sets. The 20 years of EDI data also provides us with lots of our EDI children have now left high school, and what have been their trajectories over time. And we also are working more closely with the health system in terms of trying to understand the linkage between early health services and later EDI outcomes. So we will continue to be doing that work. Mariana mentioned the dashboard. I don't need to mention that again. I'm really excited about the interactivity of that and allowing you to play around in the data in the way that makes sense for your community or region. And then check, we will, as Barry said, and we'll have a more fulsome webinar about check in the new year. You will receive the link to the EDI Wave 8 Provincial.
Here it comes right now.
Oh, golly.
I think we're putting it, there it is. Jeremy
golly.
Alexander has shared it in the chat, so you can just take a look immediately at our new website, EDI Wave 8 Provincial Summary.
You guys can all skip the holidays now because you've had as much excitement as you'll be able to manage, I'm sure. Thank you. I was just noticing so many old friends and colleagues in the participant list. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for continuing to work in what have been such challenging and often fatiguing circumstances in terms of our child serving systems over the last couple of years. Don't be strangers. We learned from you. Everything that emerges from HELP has really emerged in many ways from our relationship with all of those of you in school districts, communities, health regions around the province, and so deeply appreciative of that relationship and so looking forward to it continuing. So see you the next time. Thank you very much.